Let's talk about some fantasy tropes, specifically the ones I like. I like a little bit of most genres, but it's really no secret that fantasy is my absolute favorite, both to read in and to write in. So I'm very familiar with a lot of the recurring themes and recurring elements in these stories. There are some good ones, there are some bad ones. A lot of them actually depend on how they're used in the story, but there are still a few that I just really like to read in literature. And every time I find them, as long as they're done pretty well, I'm a sucker for them. We're talking about those today, if you haven't figured it out based on the title of the video. We're talking about my absolute favorite tropes to find in fantasy literature. I will also be making a video on my least favorite tropes if you're curious about that, so make sure you're subscribed to the channel. But today we're gonna be positive, we're gonna talk about all the ones that I absolutely love the most. I know there are people who don't really like tropes at all, so if it's something that recurs in a lot of literature in a certain genre or a certain style, they just don't like it, and if it's been done before, they don't like it at all. But personally, I think that tropes can be really useful and also really fun if you put a spin on them or if you just do them in kind of a unique way. And even if it has been done before, some stuff is just fun and opens up so much potential for the plot to where every time I find it in a story, I love it. So let's talk about those. We're gonna start off with a very obvious one for the fantasy genre, which I love, and that is the hero's journey. It's quite possibly the oldest one in the book. It's been around for ages. This idea that the story revolves around a hero, the main character, the protagonist, who has a journey to complete. Often it is an actual physical journey. It's a quest. It's something that must be done in order to save the world or save someone they love or whatever the sort of main goal is. There's a quest they must complete in order to get there. It's really probably the most simple one in the book. But let's face it, there's a reason it's been done so many times. It is just a fun concept. And it can be unique depending on your story. You can have a completely different type of hero, you can have an anti-hero, you can have a really lovable hero, a quiet hero, a bold hero, but they still have to go on this quest. And the quest itself can be extremely different. The world that you build up around it can be totally different. It can be a completely different story while still kind of resting on this base of being a hero's journey. And of course, as long as the quest is well constructed, it doesn't feel ambly, like it feels like you're going towards this goal, and it keeps it propelling. And from the beginning, or at least the sort of opening third, let's say, you know what the goal is and you have a mission to complete. And it kind of, as a reader, you get to kind of go on this mission too, and you have that resolve, that object in mind as you're reading the book. So I think it can really help the pacing, it can really help the readability, and it just makes for a fun, engaging story. The next trope is one that can often be linked with the hero's journey, and that is the normal person hero, or kind of the underdog hero. This does go really well with the hero's journey because often it's this person, this normal average person who doesn't ask to be thrown on this quest, is then forced to undergo this journey. And this one is especially cool because a normal person hero means that there's an element of relatability in it. And I kind of hate this word, I'll be honest. I've heard a lot of people use relatability as if that's like the end all be all for literature, which is not the case. You do not have to have relatable characters to be engaging, compelling, interesting characters. But at the same time, this one allows you to create a character that maybe isn't relatable in that they might have a very different background from, the reader. It doesn't have to match the reader's profile, but there's still that element that you feel like it's an average person who didn't ask for it, who didn't do anything, who was just thrown into this. And in that way, all of us can relate at least a little bit to this character and kind of feel the pressures that this character is feeling. This also opens up so many possibilities for training scenes and learning scenes and development for the character. And we as readers can often even learn stuff for them because, I mean, how many of us have, had to learn how to rule a country or win a war? I mean, these are things that we don't go through. So the training that the character has to undergo in order to figure out how the hell they're supposed to accomplish this thing, whatever this quest is that they have to accomplish, we're learning too, and we're just as clueless. So we get to go through all of this with the character, and it's kind of just this fun build up and potential. Next, of course, I have to put on this list enemy to ally. This can be enemy to lover, this can be enemy to friend or companion, or just strictly enemy to ally. The person just has to work with this other person who was originally their enemy. I am a big sucker for this trope. I absolutely love it. When two characters just clash at the beginning and just do not like each other, cannot stand each other, and they fight maybe, or there's some fun little verbal sparring, and there's just this tension, and then that tension just slowly just dissipates and turns into something else, whatever that something else is, whether it is then a romance story or if it's just allies or friends. It's so fun to watch this evolve, to feel this tension, to experience this change, this evolution. It's just so fun. And half the time as the reader, if you know it's coming, like if you're meant to know it's coming, it's fun in a way that, you know, you're watching the character like, I know what's gonna happen. You're gonna fall for them, aren't you? And then on the other hand, if you're not intended to know it and you don't predict this change, it's fun for that too, because then it's a surprise. You're like, oh my gosh, they're actually starting to get along, or they have to work together, or they're falling in love. A slight caveat to this one, because this one has been done very badly before. I've read more than a few books and watched more than a few movies where they have done this sort of enemy to ally or enemy to lover, but they've taken someone like completely unsavable and then all of a sudden you're supposed to like them. Yeah, no, there are limits. Like, I mean, if someone is flawed or if someone is kind of a morally gray character, that's fun, that's interesting. Or if just two people just, you know, don't get along, it's not necessarily right or wrong, they just don't get along and then all of a sudden they do. That's all great. That's what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about like a really evil person who's like murdered lots of people and then all of a sudden we're supposed to like them. No, 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 no. And of course, this is not limited to fantasy, but this is one that is very, very common to find in fantasy because often it can also go along with the sort of journey plot or the larger quest of the story. Here's a trope that is unique to fantasy: cool, interesting, compelling, sometimes sexy, sometimes funny fantasy creatures. This is one of the things that sets the genre apart from all the other genres. This is the one thing we got. Like, we own this one. I like a pretty wide range when it comes to fantasy creatures. I like retellings of creatures and sort of mythological beings that already exist, like your average, you know, dwarves and elves or fairies or vampires. Caveat with vampires, you probably know where I'm going with that one. I'm not going to explain that one, but not the sparkly kind. But I like when you take creatures that already exist and tell a new story with them, whether it's completely unique, your interpretation has never been done before, or whether it's, you know, somewhat standard, you know, very much based on the mythology, but then you do something interesting with the story. I love all of that. I also love when stories introduce completely new creatures that are very unique to their world. Give me a non-human, sentient being with a really interesting backstory, with a really interesting appearance, maybe with really interesting abilities. Put them in the mix often with humans, and that is just so fun. The potential there is so fun. All right, this one might be a little bit controversial because I know some people are getting a little bit tired of this one, but I still love it if it's done well or if it's done in kind of a unique way. I love a story with a secret heritage plot, or like a secret, you know, heir to something, whether it's a throne or magical powers or some sort of fame or position that this person didn't know that they had. I love it. This concept of a person who has lived their entire life a certain way, whose entire worldview and sense of self is built solid upon this one thing, this one way of life, and then all of a sudden they find out they actually are something else. I don't care how many times it's been done before. That is good. I'm not gonna lie, there's definitely ways to do this that are just cliche, that are kind of eye-rolling. There's also a couple different ways you can do it, either where it's supposed to be a surprise to the reader or where the reader knows and then the person finds out and it's a surprise to them. Either way, this can be ruined. I will admit that. But the idea is really, really good and I love it when it's done well. It just has this kind of twist element. I love literature that has a good twist in it, whether it's one that really just strikes you or it's one that's sort of built up and foreshadowed and then they twist it. And also I love that the character then has to go through that. I'm sorry, but I'm a writer. I love torturing my characters from time to time. It's what we do. And uprooting their entire life, that'll do it. To lighten things up a little bit, another trope that I really like is the found family trope. This one is really, really common. I know I'm just yet another person with a voice on booktube/authortube who likes this trope. I'm pretty sure most people I've talked to do appreciate this one, although let me know in the comments if you're one of those who doesn't for whatever reason. But I love a good story with a found family. Whatever circumstances you've introduced in your fantasy book, you've probably made some characters' lives hell. So there's nothing better than to throw them into a kind of weird, random ensemble of other characters, and then throughout the book, they actually grow together and they band together and they're either really good friends or they're kind of like a family. Whatever you want to create with it, it's just forming bonds that are unexpected. And that, as a reader and as a writer, is really fun to experience. You then also often have characters thrown together who make no sense, who have very different backgrounds, probably very different skill sets, interests, they're just really different people. So you can show different parts of your world, your fantasy world, so it's really great for world building in that way. You can do some character development because now people are thrown together with people that they really shouldn't mesh with, and for whatever reason they do, and they find things in common, and probably they also find things they don't have in common. You can have some fun like sparring dialogue, some fun little like friction between people. You can throw in an enemy to ally or an enemy to lovers. You can do a lot of stuff with this, and you can also just create a band of characters that's very diverse and that's very unique. So that's something that's really, really great with this one. No matter what kind of story you're telling, no matter what your main character or main characters are like, you can still use this trope in a very different way, and it can still be very useful to propel your plot forward. How about another controversial one? I can't just have one controversial one on my list, I have to have at least two. Another trope I really like, hear me out, is the orphan trope. I have a funny feeling that you are either very much in agreement with me right now or very much in disagreement with me right now, because people have very, very strong opinions about this one. But I love the orphan trope. It's one of the oldest in the book. Again, it's something that has been done so many times. It has just been exhausted in so many ways, and yet it still works. It's really common, of course, in young adult literature, also in middle grade literature, because often you have a protagonist who is younger, and if you have parents there, then sometimes that can actually be a little bit of a hindrance for sending this young person on a quest that they really are not old enough to handle on their own. It's not something they would volunteer to do. This isn't to say that your protagonist has to be an orphan and has to have no parents in the picture in order to have a good story. Not that at all. You can have a fantastic story and have supportive parents or non-supportive parents or just any type of parent in the story. And I love actually when authors can create a story that has an interesting dynamic where the parents can be a part of the plot and actually be involved and add something really interesting to the plot. But some stories, some ideas, some plots just work better when you have an orphan and someone without parents who is kind of left to fend for themselves, left to stand on their own 2 feet and accomplish something great and brilliant. That just makes a really good story. It sets you up for a very good story, and it also gives your character independence and the ability to really make their own decisions and guide themselves throughout the plot, which can often make for a more interesting main character. Because of this, of course, some people can kind of look at it like a way out, like an easy way out for a writer, but it's really, it's more than that. It really can set up your story in a really interesting way, and it can allow the plot and your main character to flourish in a way that sometimes not having an orphan can't. The last trope we're going to talk about today is not really going to come as a huge surprise if you've watched a lot of my other types of videos that are not necessarily writing related. I love when a fantasy story has fantasy languages. I must stress, it does not have to be Tolkien level languages, okay? You don't have to actually invent languages and have the lexicology and everything defined and, you know, make a dictionary and write an alphabet. You don't have to go that far to satisfy me. It really can just be as simple as incorporating a little bit of a language, or even just talking about languages that exist in the world, having characters who maybe have different native languages, and that can contribute to the plot / character development / all of the above. It can contribute to the story in a lot of ways, and it just adds an element of realism. As someone who lives abroad, has lived abroad in different places for years, who speaks more than one language, who is just interested in languages in general, I am so much more convinced by a fantasy world and interested in a fantasy world when it has this element somehow playing into it. If you want to go out there and invent your entire language and write your dictionary and write your alphabet and all of that, that's also fine too, especially if you're writing epic fantasy, high fantasy. That's like a really dedicated detail that you can put into your story, and that's very interesting in the same way that a complete world map at the beginning of a book. I love those things. But also, if you want to keep it a little simpler, only, you know, invent enough of it to make it very real, and only kind of come up with, I guess, the style and the writing and how it works, and portray that in your story, not necessarily have sentences written, but just be able to convince me that this thing exists and that it has a certain form and a certain purpose and a certain background. That's all that I ask for, and that adds so much more to a story. All right, on that note, I'm going to wrap up this video, but I would love to keep this conversation going in the comments below. Let me know some of your all-time favorite fantasy tropes. If I left any off the list, if you agree with any of these on the list, leave those in the comments below. I will, of course, be doing, as I mentioned, a least favorite tropes video, so save those. If you have any least favorites, save those for the next video, because I will be posting that very, very soon. Because, of course, for every really great fantasy theme that you have, you have a really bad one too. Make sure you're subscribed to this channel and you have notifications on if you want to see when I post that video. And if you want another way of keeping up with me and seeing when I post new videos, in case you don't have entire faith in the notification system, you can follow me on Instagram. I post pretty much every day in my Instagram stories and on my feed about writing, about living abroad, about what I'm up to, my cute cat. I mean, I post a lot about my cat, let's be real. So if that's a plus for you, follow me on Instagram. Thank you all so much for watching, and I will talk to you very soon in another video.